Chapter 16, The Civil War. Section 1, The War Begins. As we learned in the last chapter, when Abraham Lincoln won the election and then was sworn in as president in 1861, 7 southern states seceded from the Union. South Carolina obviously was the first one, following Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. All 7 of those states seceded from the Union, and Lincoln, when that happened, refused to recognize it as a country because they formed the Confederate States of America. He refused to recognize it. He believes it was illegal for those 7 states to leave the Union according to the Constitution. Now, as soon as those 7 states seceded, they started seizing federal posts in the South, federal mint branches. I mean, federal mints are where you make money. Arsenals is where you store weapons, and military posts, military bases, if you will. The Confederate officials started to take those. One of those federal posts that were attempted to be seized by the Confederates was Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was a federal outpost in Charleston Harbor, outside of Charleston, South Carolina. The Confederate forces asked for its surrender, but Lincoln refused, and he will send ships down to Fort Sumter to supply it with anything they may need to survive some kind of attack by the Confederates. Now, if you're looking at the picture, this is Fort Sumter right here. It's kind of a floating fortress, and over here on our map, you see Fort Sumter in the big black letters here. Right here, it's kind of like guarding the entrance to Charleston Harbor. Here's Charleston, the city, right there, Charleston Harbor. And what you see over here in red, these are all other forts that you would find in Charleston. So there's a whole bunch of them, Fort Sumter being maybe the lead one. The red means that the Confederates had taken it over already. Fort Sumter remained a federal outpost for a while, and Fort Wagner will also fall to the Confederates. Eventually, you see the blue, which means that the Union will take those over eventually. Before sunrise on April 12, 1861, Confederates will fire upon the fort, with cannons, of course. Fort Sumter will fall 34 hours later. The commander of Fort Sumter was a guy named Robert Anderson. He held on as long as he possibly could, but they just ran out of the supplies that they really needed. The ships that Lincoln promised never made it down to Fort Sumter in time. And so Fort Sumter will fall 34 hours later. When that happened, the Civil War began. When Fort Sumter fell, Abraham Lincoln declared that the South was in rebellion, and he asked all the governors of the states to supply 75,000 militiamen. After that, 4 other states are going to secede from the Union: North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, and Arkansas. So we have a grand total of 11 Confederate states at this particular point. There were 4 slave states who did not secede from the Union. They didn't join the Confederacy. They became known as the border states. Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri were those 4 states. Now, Virginia did secede from the Union, but the western side of the state supported the Union, and so they will set up their own state government and became known as West Virginia in 1863. Now, if you're looking at the map here, the red is the Union states that we can see on here. The blue are the Confederate states. The gray are the states that seceded after Fort Sumter. And the kind of aqua color are the border states. So you can see how they form kind of that border between the North and the South. We're now going to talk about the advantages and possibly disadvantages that both sides will have during this war. So we'll start with the North. That's the bluish areas here on the map. They have a population of 22 million people, where the South had far less than that. And it makes sense that the population is larger because you have more industrial areas up in north, so that would mean more people live there. 22,000 miles of railroad tracks stretched across the North. The North was more developed economically. The South is more of an agricultural-based society, but the North is more industrial. They have a more developed banking system because it's already in place, and a currency which is already in place. Now, the North had a three-part strategy in defeating the Confederacy, and this was devised by a general, a war hero from the Mexican War, named Winfield Scott. First, he wanted to blockade all the southern ports, so that would mean right down in this area, he would blockade. He would capture the Mississippi River, that's right here. Now, by capturing the Mississippi River, that would divide the South into two parts. Most of the goods that would be over here would not be able to make it over here to the eastern part. And to capture the capital of the Confederacy, which is Richmond, which is located right in Virginia, right there, pretty close to Washington, D.C. Now, when it comes to the South, they have a strong advantage when it comes to military leadership. Most of the best generals that were in the United States Army at the time came from the South. So they had a really strong military tradition that put many smart officers into battle. Another advantage that they have is fighting on their own home soil. They will decide to fight more of a defensive war. They only have to defend themselves until the North grows tired of fighting. Now, what their strategy was to win foreign allies. Kind of going back to like the revolutionary times where we really needed some foreign allies to help us defeat Britain. The South is kind of thinking that same way. So they need to win foreign allies through the use of cotton. This became known as cotton diplomacy. This was the idea that Britain would support the Confederacy because it needs cotton to make textiles over in Britain. When preparing for war, you need soldiers. And thousands of men on the onset of the war signed up to fight. So thousands of men are going to fight in this war. And a lot of the armies that were created were volunteers. Now, as the war goes on and drags on longer, you will see maybe more of a use of draft to get more people involved. But at the start, they were all volunteers. Civilians also did their part. They helped the military by raising money for supplies or uniforms or anything that the military might need, running hospitals. Women served as nurses. So you have all these volunteers who are so excited about fighting in this war, but there are going to be some problems. Both sides, the Union and the Confederacy, are going to be faced with food shortages. They're also going to be short on clothing and weapons. When it comes to the clothing idea, the Union didn't have too many issues with that because they already had the regular United States Army uniform. But for the Confederacy, they didn't have a uniform. A lot of the soldiers who were soldiers before in battle oftentimes wore their blue Union uniform. So sometimes in those early battles, it got confusing as to who you're actually shooting at because both sides could be possibly wearing the same uniform. Or you'd have soldiers who just wore whatever uniform they could find. So there was a lot of confusion early on, especially when it comes to uniforms. Now, eventually, it'll be Union who are blue and the Confederacy who are gray. But early on, it was not quite like that. The biggest problem facing the volunteers, however, is learning military basics, such as marching, shooting, and using bayonets. That was probably the hardest thing to learn. And actually, the majority of the life of a soldier during the war was training to do those things. Not fighting, but actually training. That ends section 1.